Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to look at Aristotle, the second of the Greek masters. Now, Aristotle lived somewhere around 4th century BC. Basically, these dates are not confirmed, unconfirmed dates, yeah? 384 to 322 BC. He was also a disciple of Plato, as we discussed earlier in a previous video. Plato had pretty strong opinions about poetry, the nature of poetry, the function of poetry, the method of writing poetry, and he felt very strongly, very passionately about the purpose of literature, how it should serve a certain purpose. Now, Plato, since Aristotle was Plato's disciple, Plato being the teacher, Plato being the master here, obviously Aristotle must have learned quite a bit from him. He was also the tutor. Who? Here we're talking about Aristotle. Aristotle was also the tutor of Alexander the Great. You must have heard of Alexander the Great. He was this one king who conquered half the world, or at least he's believed to have conquered more than half the world. Aristotle wrote extensively, spoke extensively, taught very extensively. But most of all his works, his extant critical works, include poetics and rhetoric. There are plenty of other works, but of all his works that are extant today, that are existing today, only poetics and rhetoric deal mainly with criticism. So poetics dealt with art of poetry, and rhetoric dealt with the art of speaking, art of speech. As we have already discussed, Plato and Aristotle lived in an age where rhetorics, or rather we could say it was an age of oratory. Okay, oratory as in the speaking form. Well, we are now currently going to look mainly at poetics. Okay, this book called Poetics. What was the nature and plan of poetics? His conclusions as in whatever findings he has written or noted down in poetics, they are rooted in Greek literature. So obviously he was a Grecian by birth. So whatever he had, whatever conclusions he came up with, all those, all those observations are based mainly on the Greek literature, the drama of his time. But so you see, why we are talking about this is because his writings are not entirely, his theories are not entirely applicable to literature of later ages or other nations. So his points may be valid to some extent, when we are considering the American literature or African literature or English literature, but you cannot fully apply to it. You cannot fully expect it to, uh, you know, work for other countries or other works of other countries. He had a very scientific approach of observation and style. While Plato did not have a very scientific approach, he was just concerned with the moral nature of work. Aristotle had a very scientific approach to, literature, literature in general, but poetry in particular. Okay, mainly he observed it in a very scientific manner. The principles from established practice made a good poet. Who would be a good poet? A good poet would be someone, a one who would be familiar with the principles, familiar with the principles from established practice, as in he must have noted down all the poetry, he must have read all the poetry, he must have read extensively, so that he must have formed an opinion of the underlying principles of all those works, so that he could apply it in his own work. Only then a poet would be a good poet. He should be familiar with various other works and should have learned the underlying principles in those works. Now, this Poetics is a treatise formed of 58 pages with 26 chapters. Okay, so overall, it just amounts to some 58 pages. But just imagine the impact it still had or has had over centuries, and still it does, you know. So it comprises of some 26 chapters. This is the plan of the poetics, how mainly in relation to the genres and the chapters in which those genres are discussed. So from chapter 1 to 4 and the 25th chapter mainly deal with poetry. Chapter 5, it deals with comedy, epic, and tragedy in a very general sense. It is not very particular, or it does not speak very extensively about any of these three. Chapter 6 to 26, chapter 6 to chapter 20, they dealt extensively with tragedy. So you see, a large amount of the major part of the work is devoted to tragedy. Now, chapter 21st to 23rd dealt with poetic diction. Here, diction would mean the kind of words that are used for poetry. You could call it poetic language. Chapter 24th to chapter 25 dealt with epic poetry. You should also know that in his age, during his age, epic, the genre of epic poetry flourished. So he devotes some two, or rather three, I think, 24, 25, and the fifth as well. He devotes some 3 chapters to epic poetry. Chapter 26, that is the last and final chapter, dealt with the comparison of poetry and tragedy. What poetry in general sense would be like and what tragedy. So again, this PPT or this video would mainly deal with poetry, while my next video would deal with tragedy. Okay, poetry in Aristotelian sense, and then tragedy in, once again, in Aristotelian sense. Observation on poetry. We are going Aristotle's observation on poetry circled around the nature of poetry and the function of poetry and the emotional appeal of poetry. We are going to look at, this is not something Aristotle himself devised these divisions. We are using it for our own convenience so that we could understand his perspective better, his point better. So, what was the nature of poetry according to Aristotle? First of all, he compares poet to a historian. Okay, so see, what is the significance of a poet and who is a historian? Why can't, are they, replaceable? Can one replace the other? Can one substitute the other? That is something he wondered about. It is not the function of the poet to relate what has happened, but what may happen, what is possible according to the law of probability or necessity. So, see, a historian is mainly concerned with whatever happened. Okay, he relates that which is past. But as a poet, he need not concern himself with what is past. He may write about some historical incident or anecdote, but he need not concern himself with the past. Okay, so the main concern of a poet is to write about what is possible, what can we do. But I mean, generally when we look at something, when we try to imagine a situation, it is usually an ideal situation. It is flawless. Say for instance, I plan to do something. Okay, normally, say for instance, you have a routine. Okay, you have a routine in which you do things in a certain order. You wake up at one time, you clean up, you eat, you go about your day doing probably some assignment or listen to some lectures, and then you do some chores at home, and then you get back to your homework, and then you will probably pray, and then you have a time frame for everything. But it is sort of disorganized. It is not well organized time. You are falling short of time. What you do is, when you start to plan, you begin to plan. When you plan, you do not make any exceptions for wastage. You have a very perfect timetable set down. You're going to write it to the minute, 5:30, I'm going to wake up, pray. Then 6:30, I'm going to do some walking, probably, get some fresh air. Then I'm going to go cook something, make something for my parents or my siblings, or if you are married, probably for your family. Then 8 o'clock, I'm going to start, working, doing the laundry or the dishes. 9 o'clock, I'm going to start making something for lunch, probably, or if you're, and my point is that your routine, the schedule you draw for yourself, it's going to be flawless. It is going to be ideal. Now, why did I have to go about ranting about your schedule or my schedule? Is to make you understand, is to make you relate to what of the function of a poet is. The function of the poet is not to deal with reality. The schedule we draw for ourselves is ideal. But the reality, do you really think you'd be able to manage to stick to that schedule for very long? Maybe to some extent, it will help you organize yourself a little bit. But can you work it out to the second, to the minute? Unfortunately not. It is not quite possible. So my point is, or at least Aristotle's point is, a poet need not concern himself with what has passed or what has happened. His main purpose is to bring in an ideal situation, an ideal image. Okay? What is ideal? As in IDEAL. The perfect possibility. So what is possible according to law of probability, as in the law of probability? What is, all the probabilities, all the possibilities, or necessity. Okay? So Aristotle believes that a poet's concern is universal, as in whatever the poet is about to tell, it applies, it has a general universality, it has a generality. It is not specific to a certain person. Even if he is talking about a certain incident that happened at a certain time, what that person would be something anyone can relate to, anyone can understand or agree with. Okay, the traits the poet gives to that poet or to that character is going to be universal, hold universal appeal. Whereas the history dealt in particular sense, it is very specific. But so and so, see, Genghis Khan, in one instance, in a historical sense, would be uh, um, uh, would be a very specific person that you won't find anywhere else. Whereas the same Genghis Khan, when it comes to probably when he is mentioned in a poem, he is bound to be someone you can relate to, someone you feel akin with, a kinship with. Yeah. Poetry infuses an universal appeal. A universal appeal, as in, it is universally, it has a universal appeal to it. It is universally understood, appreciated, giving way for truths embedded in those facts. So poetry infuses a universal appeal even to history, giving way to truths embedded in those facts. So the history may be biased, it may not give you the entire facts, at least it may not give you the truth behind those facts, because facts are what, the incidents that are related to you. That's what facts are. And what is truth? Facts are far different from truth. Truth is far different from facts. So, truth embedded in those facts is what the poet is concerned with. As far as the function of poetry is concerned, Plato believes that the main purpose of poetry is to give pleasure, to provide pleasure. He has no qualms about it, because unlike his master Plato, who believed that poetry should serve a higher purpose, that it has to give some, moral teaching to people, Aristotle never believed in, poetry's need to teach. Okay, but Butcher, in his Aristotle's theory of poetry and fine arts, Butcher is one of Aristotle's critics. Okay, he writes in Aristotle's Theory of Poetry and Fine Arts that from the Aristotelian and Greek point of view, art is an element in the higher life of the community. The pleasure it affords is an enduring pleasure, an aesthetic enjoyment which is not divorced from civic needs. Okay, as in, from Aristotelian Greek point of view, what you understand is that art is an element in the higher life of the community. That is, in the community, art is something that is held high. It has a very high standard. It is something that holds the community together. The pleasure it affords is an enduring pleasure. Any form of art provides pleasure, and he believes that it is an enduring kind of pleasure that does not end, or that is not invalidated. Okay, an aesthetic enjoyment which is not divorced from civic ends. It is an aesthetic enjoyment. Okay, this art itself is an aesthetic enjoyment which is not divorced from civic ends, as in social purpose or social obligations. Aesthetic enjoyment cannot be divorced from civic ends, which would mean that both art should have beauty, at the same time it should teach beauty, pleasure, and some social purpose. Some civic purpose is in social purpose. The emotional appeal of poetry. What would be the emotional appeal of poetry? According to Aristotle, tragedy is the highest form of poetry as it arouses the emotion of poetry, pity, and fear. See, the same thing, the emotion of pity and fear, as far as Aristotle's tutor is concerned, Plato is concerned, is the bane of tragedy. As in, this emotion, the stimulation of emotion of pity and fear is what is weakening, people. It's weakening the audience. Whereas Aristotle believes that it is the highest form of poetry, is mainly because it arouses the emotion of pity and fear. Pity, why pity? Because it pity to see, when you pity when you see someone undeserved sufferings of the hero. Okay, when the hero is suffering but does not deserve to suffer, you feel pity for that person. If it is just, as in the hero made a mistake because of which he is suffering, that is like, okay, fine, let him suffer. If it is undeserved, you feel pity for that hero. And fear, because you are afraid that the worst may befall him. Alright, so tragedy is the highest form of poetry because it arouses the emotion of pity and fear. And what pity, how does an audience feel pity for the hero? When his sufferings are undeserved. And you're afraid for him because something worse could happen to him. Now, this pity and fear would bring about catharsis in a person. Okay? As an audience, when you feel pity and fear for a hero, for the protagonist of a tragedy, what do you undergo? You undergo catharsis. Catharsis as in purgation of emotion. Purgation, you could say purification of emotion. And how does it happen? These emotions find free outlet, relieving the soul of their excess. See, you have to think about Plato here and Plato's understanding of the stimulation of emotion of pity and fear when you watch tragedy, and Aristotle's understanding of how this stimulation affects a person, affects an audience. You have to compare these two. Why? Because Plato believed this pity and fear, this stimulation of pity and fear made men weak. It made them all the more used to pitying themselves. When you start pitying others, you begin to pity yourself more. People indulge in self-pity. They are more afraid. Whereas Aristotle believed that when we do have all of these inside us without any external stimulus. Okay, we already have all these emotions. We have both pity and fear inside us. Okay, but when we watch tragedy, this excessive amount of pity and fear that resides within us, within our conscious thoughts, that would be purged, that would be purified, and excess would be relieved. It finds an outlet for, We find an outlet to relieve ourselves of these emotions, thereby purifying our soul, and we become better people. All right, we become better by removing these negative, negative feelings from our minds, from our emotions. Now, by spending these emotions on others, we learn to be nobler and less self-centered. See, even though Aristotle learned from Plato, he has a very different way of looking at these emotions. Okay, he says that we learn to be nobler, whereas Plato believes that we become weaker. Okay, and we become selfish, we become self-centered. Aristotle believed that we become nobler and we become less self-centered because we learn to pity others' weaknesses. Now, see, we need to understand this basic distinction between pity and sympathy and empathy. Okay, when we speak of pity, sympathy is what you is when you feel sorry for someone. Okay, when someone else is going through some kind of misfortune, you feel sorry for that person. That would be sympathy. When you put yourself in their place and feel for them, that would be empathy. Okay, so whereas sympathy is more objective, an objective attitude towards another person who is facing some misfortune. Empathy is more subjective, as in it is more personal in nature. Now, pity has a very negative connotation because it neither feels very strongly about others nor does it have any inclination to help the other person out. Okay, so see, pity is a very as someone said, it does not really, it's not really a fine quality. Okay, and not a quality you indulge in. All right, so when you start feeling for others, what Aristotle believes is that you become a little less selfish, a little less self-centered. You start thinking about more about other people. Okay, and it is a good practice, at least for according to Aristotle, it's a good practice when you start, start feeling for someone in a play, in a make believe play. Obviously you'll feel more strongly when it comes to real life. Thank you for today. This is all for today. Thank you for now, and hopefully in my next video we'll be dealing with Aristotle's objectives or observations on tragedy. Some would be a little more interesting than the others. Till then, stay safe, be happy. Assalamu alaikum.